What is up, my helicopter people? Welcome to THP, the helicopter podcast. I'm trying to do the abbreviation thing. So if you like it, let me know. I'm just maybe thinking of some future swag, like you get your hat on and it's like THP. I don't know. I'm just throwing some ideas out there, but welcome to the helicopter podcast. I'm your guy, Halsey Schider, and a big thanks to our platform at Vertical Helicast for making the podcast possible. And a big shout out to all of our sponsors that also make the podcast possible. Couldn't do it without them. And more importantly, I couldn't do it without you, the listener. So thank you guys for listening. Please continue to listen, like, subscribe, follow, share, whatever you're supposed to do. You know what to do. We're all used to this social media thing now. I am excited to be joined by Eli Bickley today. Eli, I think did you reach out via Insta? Is that how we connected?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So one of my go ahead. I'm stepping on you.
Yeah, I reached out because I had some students, and we had one of my old instructors in, and we talked for like 3 hours, and he told stories from his experiences now flying, and I think you're going to have him on, and we talked for like 3 hours, and I was like, man, this would work on a podcast. And I've been listening to your podcast really since you started. So I reached out, I was like, hey, you should have my friend Nick on. And then you're like, yeah, why don't you come on too? So thanks for
I mean, that's what it's funny. I get people that reach out, which I love. So thank you to not just Eli, but anyone that reaches out, says hi, gives a recommendation. But I love it because everyone's always like, oh, you should interview this guy. And then I learn about what you're doing. And I'm like, well, I should also interview you, because I think no matter where you're at in this industry, whether you're a spring chicken or a very experienced guy or gal or somewhere in the middle, I think that you can add value. And I think this is perfect. In fact, I was trying to think. It's kind of weird. I've been doing enough podcasts where I kind of I don't remember every little bit and piece or every guest, so to speak. I mean, they're all just so great. They all bring something new.
Yeah.
And I remember key points of different guests that I've had on over time, but I don't think that I've had a guy in your situation where you're a CFI, but you're like a mid-time. You're like a half-life CFI. You're, yep. I think, just under 600 hours, which I think is an interesting conversation. I have a lot to talk to you about that, because I have feelings and thoughts on being like a CFI between that 500 and 700 hour range. I think that would be interesting to dive into.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, just give us a little brief history of you and what you are here in the industry.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so I'm a spring chicken, like you said. So I've loved helicopters since I was a kid. I'm one of those guys. My first exposure. If you'd asked me what I was going to be when I was 3, I would have said a pilot. And then when I was probably 8 or 9, somewhere in that age range, a guy from our church took a group of young boys to the State Police Aviation Unit here in upstate New York, in Albany, where I still currently live. And we got to tour the governor's ship, the S-76, a couple of Bell 430s, Bell 407, and then some Hueys. And so we got to walk around, sit in them, and I was hooked. And envisioned myself going there from that time. But then, life happened, and as a teenager, started to explore aviation a little bit. Thought I might go into the Air Force or the military to fly for a little while. Didn't end up going that route. Pursued the fixed wing route a little bit, going to a local community college that has an aviation program, but didn't end up doing that either. just due to at the time that was probably like sophomore, junior of high school that I was starting to pursue that, and looked at it and went, I don't want to go into that much debt right now. I had some money set aside for college from grandparents and stuff like that, and so decided to go the community college and state university route to just get a business degree, which I'm really grateful for. It was good. So I went to community college here in upstate New York, and then SUNY University at Albany for business and finance. Um, after and didn't totally give up on the aviation dream. Oh, in my high school years, early high school years, I was also in Civil Air Patrol. I don't know if you're familiar with.
Oh, CAP guy. I
Yeah,
was in
Cap.
CAP.
You were?
I was a
Nice,
capper. Yeah,
nice,
for our listeners out there, if
good
you're
times.
not familiar with CAP, Civil Air Patrol, it's an auxiliary of the United States Air Force.
Yes, it is.
And it's geared towards young men and women that are interested in pursuing a career in the military and or aviation, really, because a lot of it is being Air Force specific. You get the opportunity to do some flying. In fact, some of my earliest flying experiences of getting on the controls was glider flying with
Nice.
the CAP,
Yep,
and also flying in their 206 that they had there at their Oregon squadron.
nice.
And it was pretty cool. It's like, yeah, I remember I would show up for like, I think it was like Tuesday nights, show up to an old armory, and you would wear your BDU, your camis.
Yep.
You do like military stuff. You would drill, you would do some education. So it's kind of like Boy Scouts, but kind of more like tailored towards military.
Yeah.
Inclusive for girls too, right? I think in my squadron it was mostly guys, but there was a couple gals in there as well.
Yep.
And a neat experience. I think ultimately the squadron that I was in was a little bit of like a lame duck squadron, to be honest. I don't know if all Civil Air Patrol is created equally. So it kind of just wasn't getting out of it, I think, what I wanted. So I think I kind of pressed on, but I did it for, I think 3-4 years. I mean, I did it for a long time. So it's cool to hear that the Civil Air Patrol. And if you're younger, you're listening to the podcast, look into the Civil Air Patrol. It's a cool program. Even if you don't want to necessarily get into the military, it's good on your college resume or application, I guess is what I didn't go to college, so I'm sure they call it out application, but it looks good there. And it's good for structure and things like that. And you get to do some flying depending on where you're at. So
I got to ride in a C-130 a couple times,
but that's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah, I never got to do that.
Yeah, it was cool. Yeah, that was when we did the encampment. I don't know if you ever did that, where it's like a week long.
Yeah. So there was. I never did an encampment again. I was like in a lame duck squadron for whatever reason. It kind of fizzled for whatever reason. So you CAP in high school, you go a different route. You end up going the college route, business, finance.
Yep.
And that led you into, did you go straight into then owning your own business? I believe landscaping?
I did. Yeah. So 2018, I graduated and went right into, I'd been working through college for a guy doing landscaping and snow removal in the winter. And so I had done the finance route, had pursued a little bit of that. Didn't really want to do what most of my classmates were doing, which was go to New York City, work for one of the big 5 financial firms, and climb the corporate ladder. That wasn't really for me. And then, so I pursued a couple small opportunities, or weren't small opportunities, but opportunities at smaller financial firms in this area. Didn't pan out, and I'm glad they didn't. And like all the appreciation in the world for the guys that do finance and can sit behind a computer all day and run numbers. Wasn't for me. I'm glad that I didn't end up going that route. So I started my own landscaping business that summer because I kind of knew that world. Got a loan from my parents and bought a truck and a trailer and a mower and just started doing that. Got married that same summer to my wife. And she was a full-time nurse at the time. And so that was helpful that we had that extra income. And I decided when I started the business that, and I recommend this for anybody who starts a business or starts into something big. I decided I was going to go 3 years before I quit because I was like, I know this is going to get hard at some point, but I don't want to back out just because it's hard or because it's So I want to go. I want to see this through at least 3 years, barring something crazy, before I really like make a big decision about growing it really big, taking out a lot of debt or something, and or quitting or downsizing, what have you. And so I did around the 3 year mark. Was starting to look at okay, I'd grown to 2 trucks, 2 crews doing maintenance, lawn maintenance, and then one crew doing that, and then one crew doing hardscape construction, so like patios and walkways and retaining walls, things like that. And decided at that 3 year mark, yeah, I don't want to grow this really big. I don't want to grow it really small either, or I don't want to like stop completely. But this isn't what I want to do long term. And talking with my wife, she was like, "Well, what would you want to do long term?" I was like, "Well, if I could do anything, I'd go into aviation." So we started pursuing a little bit. This was in 2020. This was the end of summer 2020, and we started pursuing the idea of me getting my pilot's licenses and certifications and everything, and found that there was a helicopter school 5 minutes from our house, right here in Saratoga, New York, Saratoga County Airport. So independent helicopters. And so I came in, did an intro flight with my now boss, who became my primary flight instructor, and now my boss, Matt Taggart, and did an intro flight with him. And doors off, August. I was like, okay, I have to come back. There's no way I'm not doing this.
When you were thinking of aviation, talking and having that conversation with your wife, were you thinking of aviation as a whole, like potentially fixed wing as well? And it was just like so happened, like, oh, and look, there's some helicopters that fly over our house. We should go check that out too. Like, how did it narrow down to helicopters?
Yeah, well, like I said, so I had a really fascination with helicopters ever since I'd gone and seen the state police helicopters as a little boy, and so helicopters were kind of like first on my radar. I also looked into fixed wing, but in looking at the time, this was my decision making process. I've learned more at this point, but I looked at helicopters and airplanes and said, looks like with helicopters you're home more often, or at least home more regularly. I've learned that that's not always the case depending on your industry sector. But it's not the airlines. You're not across the world weeks at a time, and living out of a hotel room, and so that was at the time, that was like, okay, not only do I love helicopters, but, the helicopters look much more conducive to the lifestyle that my wife and I want to have with our kids, which is, there's going to be some travel, but home for most nights. And so that was the decision-making process there.
Yeah. I mean, the helicopter industry can be, right. It's,
right.
I think I always like look at fixed wing, like long-term. I think long-term fixed wing is pretty nice because you make lots of money and your schedule is pretty conducive to like family, other things than work, but it takes a long time to get there.
Right.
Helicopters, I think you can get to your pinnacle a little bit faster, but admittedly, pay is not as grand as maybe a left seat in a large airline capacity captain.
Right.
And the schedule is tough. I mean, the air medical is obviously a big industry. Air medical is typically not located in big cities. I mean, obviously they have helicopters in big cities. Those are usually specialty helicopters, like for babies and things like that. And those are obviously very sought after. It takes some seniority to get to those bases. By and large, like a lot of the bases are, in the middle of nowhere because you have to get somewhere. Kind of the whole premise. So that can be hard. When I worked air medical, it was if you can find a base that's like an hour from your house, then I mean you are home every day.
Right.
At least I was. I mean, I chose to commute. It was 2 hours round trip every day, but throw out a podcast. I recommend the helicopter podcast, by the way, if you're commuting. And so it's not too bad. I think there's other jobs within helicopters. Utility might take you it's kind of that balance, right? You may be gone fighting fire for a season, but then you're home kind of during the off season doing something else. So,
Right.
it's interesting. It's I think one of the hard parts of aviation as a whole is the juggling of family
Right.
and work.
Right.
And the funny thing about our work is it's like a labor of love and passion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our
It is.
spouses, I think if you have a good spouse, they realize that, like, this
Yeah.
isn't just paying the bills for us, but this is something, my partner loves doing.
Right.
And but that's difficult, right? I mean, it's like,
Right.
you meet a lot of people in the industry that have had marriages go south, because of just the aviation schedule, not just helicopters, fixed wing as well. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
interesting. It's one of the things to consider, getting into aviation. I certainly would always recommend getting into aviation. In fact, we need more people to get involved in aviation.
Yep.
But life-work balance is tough. And especially in the beginning, you're flying a lot. You have to take opportunity. I think on my podcast, a common theme is like a lot of the guys and gals have, they moved here and then they moved here and then they moved there and then they moved there. It's a lot, but it's worth it if you can stick it out.
Yep. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we've, when I started to realize, okay, so helicopters, yeah, you can be home more often with the more sought after jobs or the jobs that you get to, but what's it going to be like in between? And so I intentionally reached out to guys that were living the life that I wanted to live, that had kids, had a long-term marriage, but had been in aviation for a while. And I was like, how do you do it? Because there's so many stories, and the classic aviator is, when you think of the guy, helicopter, Hawaiian shirt, I'm thinking of Lost, movies like that, the classic, overgrown beard. And that's not what I want to be. And I talked to a couple guys. There's one in particular. He's an EMS pilot currently, and has got 10 kids. And
oh my God.
And is same wife, and has a really healthy home life.
Poor lady.
How do you do it? I know, crazy.
She's been pregnant for 20 years?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. And I was like, how do you do it? And he was like, you just decide that that's the priority. But if you can fly and you can do that in a good way, then you just do it. And one of the big things he says, if you're in a job that's working, don't rush out of it. And if it's not working, then look elsewhere. And he was like, live where you're going to work, which is a hard one, but it's kind of determined that, okay, we're probably going to live where I'm going to work. I'm probably not going to do the 2 weeks in the Gulf or the month in Africa, or probably won't do those jobs. And we'll just see where it takes me. It is interesting though. It's an interesting one.
You have to pick your path. You have to always be flexible. Producer Zach, actually, who's who you met a second ago. Mm-hmm. Producer Zach, you can chime in too if you want. We can have you join. I don't even know if that works, but he was flying air medical, which is something that he wanted to do kind of his whole career, and then had an opportunity to go to the news in San Antonio and fly the news. And it was 6 minutes away from his house. He could ride his bike there actually in 6 minutes. I think it was a quicker drive. And yeah, I mean, one may look at that as like a different step or a step in the wrong direction. You're flying now a 206 Jet Ranger compared to the 407. It's maybe not as glorious or glamorous. Not that EMS really is, honestly speaking. But for him, 3 little kids, 6 minutes from his house. I mean, it just made more sense. And so I think you have to, again, if family is the priority, you just make it work. Yeah. I think early on in the career, the family has to be like a little more flexible and open. And, as things kind of settle out, then, you can kind of maybe find your long-term placement. Right. So you did your demo flight. I want to talk about, kind of want to get more into the helicopter side, of course, and where you're currently at, talk about your flight school, where you're at. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors.
Sweet.
Bell is proud to sponsor Vertical Helicasts and their vision to hold meaningful mission, safety, and best practice conversations in the helicopter industry. The lessons learned from these conversations will undoubtedly shape the future of both new and veteran helicopter operators.
All right. Thank you to our sponsors for making the Helicopter Podcast possible. Talking with Eli. Eli reached out via Instagram. Please reach out. I love hearing from people. Usually try to get back with everyone in a fair amount of time. Was I responsive, Eli, or did it take a day or two?
Yeah. I can't remember if it took a day. It probably took a day or two, but a reasonable amount of time for a busy man like yourself.
This is probably not like advisable because, this is, I guess, a business. I don't treat it that way all the time. And I mean that in a positive way, but I don't have social media on my phone because I feel like if I'm on social media or if it's on my phone, it's just too accessible. You can kind of go down the social media rabbit hole. Yep. So I only have it on my iPad, and I'm not always good about checking like Instagram from my iPad. So sometimes I go in there, I'm like, oh God, this poor guy's sent me a message like a week ago. So if you do send a message and it takes some time, I apologize. I'm trying to get better. But yeah, talking with Eli, he reached out via Insta and around a 600-hour pilot. So you go to Independent Helicopters. Yep. I'm familiar with them. You guys have is it Heather who owns the company?
Yep. Heather Howley. Yep. She started
so
the
Heather's
company.
like killing it on social. Like her videos blow up. She has all these cool kind of instructional videos. And did I see recently like an online ground school now that you guys are rolling out? What's that all about?
Yeah, that's been we've had that for the private side for at least 2 years because I used it, or at least 3 years, I guess. So we're rolling out a commercial and an IFR pretty soon.
So how did that work? School. Like was your ground school like exclusively via online, or is it in conjunction with your CFI as well?
Yeah, it's in conjunction with CFI. So like I'm using it right now with my students as much as they want to. You'd have to pay additional for it, pay for CFI time and pay for the online ground. But it's videos in PowerPoint, it's not PowerPoint mode, but it's videos with good graphics and stuff explaining everything from aerodynamics to weather, and then we'll use that to discuss as a launching pad to do one-on-one.
Yeah, I think that's a nice training tool. We had Kenny Keller on from Helicopter Online Ground School, and I was thinking about it. It's been a hot minute since I've been in the training environment, especially as a student. But I feel like, man, I kind of wish when I was going through school, I had that available to me because, it's one thing to, open up what is like the book that we all have, like the Principle of Helicopter Flight or whatever it is. It's a good book, actually. I mean, it has good pictures. Yeah. It's fairly like consumable, right? It's not like you're reading the FAR AIM or something. Like you can read the book and kind of get the idea, but not everyone are like great learner readers. And I'm one of those guys. I'll start reading something and then I'll get through like 10 pages and be like, I was just thinking about what I'm having for dinner this week and what I'm doing later. And I just don't, it doesn't absorb well all the time. So I feel like having something that's a little more interactive, kind of video, graphic, whatever it may be, I feel like that would be a pleasant way to supplement the ground training, learn a ground topics, maybe something, some of the weird stuff like, the symmetry of lift, right? To me, that was like really weird and complicated in the beginning. It would be nice to like have the ground instruction on the dissymmetry of lift and then be able to go home, not just be able to read about it, but then also be able to like consume this other ground school. Has it been like a successful training aid for your students? And was it nice for you?
Yeah. I used it and it was great. It provided a great foundation to be able to then go and have a conversation about it with my instructor and or go and take a quiz, and Heather and Matt are the assistant chief pilot and operations manager. Their big thing is simplicity, and I've adopted that. Like keep it simple, and so one of the things I love about the online ground school is it keeps it very simple. Like it goes through quick. You kind of sometimes, like when I was going through it, I'd have to pause it every couple minutes, be like, okay, hold on, what did you say? Um, but it keeps it simple and concise with really good graphics and stuff like that. And then you can go and take it and go to your instruction and be like, okay, I don't really understand this. How does this work? And you can kind of like, then I have the opportunity now as the instructor to expand on that, or help a student, understand it from a different perspective, or what have you.
Yeah, totally. I
So
think
it's
I
great.
think it's
It's
pretty
great.
neat. So
Yeah,
obviously, I think you still are owning and operating your business. You
I
were
am.
owning
Yep.
and operating your business during your training. A lot of the listeners, I think it's a mixed bag. I think some individuals are, full-time helicopter students. Maybe they're younger, maybe it's a second career, but they're just like full-time. It's like what they're doing.
Yep.
And there's others like yourself that were doing it, but also had other full-time responsibilities, not just with family, but with work.
Yeah.
How did you juggle that during your flight training? How long did your training take? And what would be some tips for someone like yourself or someone who is maybe in a similar situation to where you would love to make helicopters maybe the full-time priority, but it's my understanding that your landscaping business helped finance
Yes.
your helicopter training. So obviously you had to keep doing it. One couldn't happen without the other. So what was that like to juggle, and what is kind of your insight on being able to do it and do it successfully?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, so I
Thank you.
I I was am still running my landscaping business. Just do hardscape stuff now, so we don't do the maintenance side of things. So we do basically construction projects, and I throughout the summer hire between like 1 and 3 guys to work on those, and I kind of form in each project. Um, and So during my training, and then last summer as well, and it looks like this summer as well, I was both at the airport flying, and then I'd go, work on a project. I'd take a day to be full time here, and then I'd be a day or a half day on a project. And um, I mean, it really comes down to prioritizing. So when I was training, I looked at my flight training as the main thing I was doing, unless I started to, my wife and I started to suffer financially. It's kind of like, okay, this is I'm focusing on this. My business is also going. I need to keep that, continue, doing excellent work, providing, quality, communicating well with my customers. I need to do all that. As long as that's going well, flight training is my priority. And as long as that's paying the bills. As soon as that, if, so that's the priority, I guess, in a sense. But as far as my time spent and my, it was like, okay, I'm setting aside an hour. Like, for example, I'd set aside an hour every day to study written questions when I was getting ready for written tests, and I'd just an hour every day until I was ready for that written exam, and without really uh, going back on that. The other thing that helped is that in the winter I do plowing, so that I'm really only doing that when it's snowing. So I had a lot of free time in the winter, and do now. Um, and Yeah, yeah, man. It's tough because when you're juggling that, and now I'm juggling. We've got 2 kids, so juggling business, being a really full time flight instructor, and 2 kids, it really just takes prioritizing every hour and going, okay, this hour, and engaging with what you're doing in that hour. So like, okay, if I'm at home with my kids, my phone is gone, and I am at home with my kids. Now, when I'm at the airport working with a student or flying, and giving myself time before that. Okay, I need 30 minutes before this flight to be ready and fully engaged with it. And then, okay, now I'm going on to go, check in on a patio that's being built. I'm fully there. Okay, my phone's on now because I need to answer. I'm an employee at Independent, so I can't not answer the phone with them. But when I'm with my employees that are working on a job, fully engaged with them, and it's taken a lot of discipline. Getting up early every day, going to bed early, so to get good sleep, and eating well. I've got my wife is an incredible. She's incredible. She cooks really well for us. She's really focused on keeping our food healthy and clean, and and our lifestyle healthy and clean at home. So that's big. I couldn't, I actually I really couldn't do it without her doing what she's doing, uh, because she keeps our life really clean and healthy at home, and so then I can be focused outside the home. Um, so got to give her that incredible credit.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah,
nice
discipline
to
and focus, and
yeah,
being engaged when you're where you are.
yeah, I think having, the engagement too, I think that's an important way to look at it. Something that I struggled with is when I decided to leave full-time flying and go into, being engaged in my business at Helicopter full-time. That was my priority because
Right,
that now kind of transitioned to where, okay, it's not really a side hustle anymore and like just, beer money, but this is like now how I'm going to pay my mortgage and
right,
pay my other bills and fuel our financial life. And so it adds a dimension, but I didn't want to fully stop flying. So I ended up, securing a part-time news flying job in San Antonio as well. Um, and then, of course, the day that I finished training, that pilot that was flying the contract ended up having a heart attack.
man.
So I went from part-time to full-time. I think I did it for like 6, 7, maybe even 8 months. And that was challenging. And I don't want to say unsafe, but there was times where I wasn't feeling like I was fully connected in the cockpit
Yep.
because my mind was somewhere else within the business. Or, I was working at closing and I had to be kind of available for escrow issues, during closing, but
Yep.
here I am flying right now. And so that was really difficult. And I've seen that in students as well. I see that in like private owner guys and
Yeah.
gals that want to get into helicopters, not as a career, but they're wealthier individuals. They want to fly helicopters. It's a passion, a hobby. But then they show up to flight school and they can't disconnect from their real life, like
Yeah.
what's paying them all this money to be able to be doing what they're doing. And I think it's important if you're someone like Eli in a position where you're having to wear multiple hats. I think I like what Eli said about being engaged on what you're doing at that time. You know, when you're with your kids, you're with your kids. That's the time. But most importantly, when you're flying the helicopter, you got to be on,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you got to be on your A game. As a
Yeah.
student, yeah, you got someone there to hopefully protect a silly mistake if you're not fully engaged or present in the moment. But then transitioning as into a CFI, full time pilot, whatever it may be, you do have to bring your A game every
Yeah.
day, even as you gain experience. And so that is tricky. So my advice to our listeners is, if you're juggling it, make sure that you can disconnect enough when you're in the cockpit. Because I've been in a situation where I don't feel disconnected, and it's not a great place to be because at the end of the day, nothing matters if you don't get home safely.
Right.
And so,
Right.
uh, that's tough. It's hard to juggle, but it seems like you've done a good job. And lifestyle, of course, is important. Getting up early, people tell me all the time, like, "Oh, there's just not enough time in the day." I'm like, "Well, what time do you get up?"
Right.
Right?
Yep.
I choose to get up early. I hate it. Actually, I don't. I'm like, I'm okay at it. Like, I tolerate it. I'm better at it. But it still sucks, right? Every morning, getting up at 5 and working all day. It's tiresome. But sometimes you got to add hours to the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And for us, it's been going to bed early too, because you still got to get that sleep, especially as a pilot. And I think that's going back to what you're saying about being fully engaged in the flight, and I think that's what I mean when say like flight school and then now instructing is my priority, in the sense that, like, it's not paying all the bills as an instructor, but it can pay enough where I'm not going to try and get rich outside of that. Just going to try and do enough to do what I do well, so that I can have that integrity. But I'm not trying to have 3 crews out there doing construction jobs. Got and like, I'm looking at this summer and I'm going, okay, if I'm going to have, I don't know who's going to work for me yet, and so I'm looking at it and going, okay, if I don't have some people who I can trust and who I can just leave for hours at a time, knowing that, okay, they're gonna, if something happens, they'll either figure it out, or they won't do anything that's gonna stress me out to a crazy degree.
Yeah.
Then I'm just not gonna do it, and I'm gonna figure something else out, because because my priority as far as my attention needs to be, here with my flights, um, and with my students in ground. I mean, that too, if you're sitting there on your phone, and I struggle with this sometimes, my phone's going off, when I'm doing a ground session, I'm like, okay, I just need to put this away from it because this student is paying for this time, or drove an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours to be here for this 2 hour block where we're talking. And yeah, so
it can be very disrespectful, right, to a student when you're not fully engaged with them.
Yeah.
They're spending a lot of money. They've traveled, like you said. So yeah, I think in all aspects, you always have to be engaged, and you always have to make sure. I've also seen like CFIs openly announce like the reason why. I mean, I had a CFI one time that was like, "Hey, we have to fly an extra 0.5 today so I can hit my 700 hours total time."
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, like you want me to pay for an extra half hour? Like,
Yeah.
I don't. What, that doesn't benefit me at all. Like I'm done with my lesson. I'm fatigued. I don't want to do any more flying. Like,
yeah, especially for private level where it's not the PIC.
Yeah. Go get your 0.5 another day, pal. Like not on my dime, Charlie. But I always like to ask with individuals that are a little more recent in training than I was, some areas within the training that were difficult for you. For me personally, I was not. Auto rotations were hard. I've talked about it on the podcast before. For me, it was the funniest thing. I don't know if I've talked about this before, and if I have, deal with it. I could not really auto, even after I got my private, good enough, I guess, to get my license. And going into my commercial check ride, I was on the struggle bus with autos. And what it was not keeping my eyes outside. I was glued inside, right, watching that RPM, because you kind of get scared. Like that's your lifeline. So it's like my eyes are glued there. But I had a dream that I was doing auto rotations. And in my dream, I was looking outside and I was doing the auto, and it was like butter. And literally that next day I went out and like it changed.
That's pretty cool.
From that point on, it was like, honestly, like, wow, I can auto now. And it's as simple as keeping your eyes outside. What was it for you during your training that you found difficult? Was there areas within the flight portion that were challenging, scary, hard?
Yeah. So I would say the three things I struggled the most with were autos, like you say, steep approaches, and slopes, slope landings. And still, sometimes when I go to demonstrate a slope landing, I'm like, boy, I hope I can do this. Thinking back to my private and commercial check rides, I remember going in, particularly with the autos, going, I think I can pull this off. Like, at least, my instructor thinks I can, Matt thinks I can pull this off. So I guess and I did, somehow. But those were the hardest. And once I started instructing, going, and starting instructing autos was huge. I mean, I think like within the first 3 or 5 autos instructing, where there's no safety net, and there's, that really, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I can't just maybe have my eyes outside. Like I have to have my eyes outside. I can't just maybe feel what the helicopter's doing. Like I have to feel that load factor. And I have to, raise collective, punch the cyclic forward to stop an overspeed, I can't just maybe be good at that,
The old R22 right jab.
Yeah. Yep.
You got pretty good at
that. Yeah.
And it's kind of funny, right? It's like, it truly is, you can feel it coming, right? You get real heavy. You're like, uh-oh.
Yep. Here it comes.
Abort.
Yep.
Yeah. In fact, it's kind of funny. This is a decent segue, because recently I had someone reach out on Instagram. Sorry, I forget the name or the handle, but their question was, they're a low time pilot and they're not going into instructing right now, but they have an opportunity to go and do a job somewhere. And, he was asking like, man, I'm, kind of feeling nervous. I don't know if I'm ready. And, those are all important questions, right? And truly at some point, if you really don't feel that you're ready, then you shouldn't do it. That's probably the best advice. But to a point, especially getting into a flight instruction role, the very beginning of flight instruction is like, man, I have no business being here. Right. And my best advice to that individual was like, you have to understand that, yes, you're newer, but you have the training and you've gone through the certification process to be in the seat.
Yeah.
And so you've done something right. And you've shown, DPEs and instructors that you can do it safely and do it correctly. Now you just have to go and do it. It doesn't mean that you're going to have some sleepless nights, right? I remember going into introducing autos for the first time, 180 autos for the first time in the pattern with students. Like that was like keeping me up at night, right? That was definitely giving me some nerves.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing is, in the beginning, you may be more on the controls, right? Your student may not get the best experience because you're a little bit on the controls, and that's whatever, that will come with time. But you go at your own pace, right? And you start slow and you build up to it and you rely on the training that you have. And it usually seems that you actually are in a better spot than you think you are. Or at least that was kind of my experience. And I think it has to be slightly industry wide because we've talked about it before, this idea of like the blind leading the blind, 200-hour CFI. But there's not, to my knowledge, there isn't a ton of like training accidents involving these low time CFIs. I think statistically speaking, it's relatively safe. So that makes me believe that like, yes, we're all probably feeling the same. We're all having these nerves. We're all anxious about something, but we're all doing something correctly and probably a little bit better than we even think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a big thing that matters there is the brass, if you will. Here it's a solid 50 hours before you start to 50 hours dual given before you start doing autos.
Yeah, it's smart.
And if I was a CFI just going into teaching somebody privately, without the accountability of working for people who are much more experienced than I am, I could picture that being a lot more sketchy, without having that accountability and that. But that was, you get used to, okay, that the students are going to do some weird things. Okay, in that first 50 hours, the weird things are in normal approaches or in straight and level flight. It's not, halfway through a 180 auto at 200 feet AGL, and so you get used to the helicopter and sitting in the left seat. And I think it's important to have good accountability and people that are behind you and leading you that have seen it before, Yeah,
it's nice to work into it. I think it's super important. I want to talk more about your journey into instruction, but first we're just going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor.
Thank you to our sponsor, Hillsboro Heli Academy. Embark on your helicopter pilot journey with Hillsboro Heli Academy. Known worldwide, they make it easy to achieve both U.S. and European helicopter licenses. Visit flyhaa.com to schedule your introductory flight and turn your dream into a career.
All right. Thank you to all of our sponsors at the Helicopter Podcast. Appreciate y'all. And, excited to have such awesome sponsors on board. We have OEMs, parts manufacturers, the world's best helicopter brokerage, of course, Helicopter. So just all very pleased to have all the sponsors on board. And love having great guests on the show like Eli. And I love that Eli had reached out. So if you're interested in being on the podcast, please make sure you reach out. Eli, before the break, we were talking about, becoming the instructor. Just like most, it sounds like during your training, auto rotations were a little bit challenging. Steep approaches.
Yeah.
DPE. DPE that I had Mark Holstat. Shout out. What's up, Mark? Not sure you're a podcast listener, but he told me during my private check ride that he can tell a good stick versus a bad stick on their steep approach. It's such a precision move.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so hard. And in fact, what I always tell people is like a steep approach and a normal approach by far are harder than an auto rotation. They're just less scary because auto rotations have some inherent risk to them, quote unquote. But really the auto is quite simple if you enter correctly.
Right.
So here you are now. We fast forward. You have almost 600 hours now of flight time. one of the things that I've always kind of said, and others have said this as well, so I'm not taking claim to this statement, but I do believe that there's certain milestones within a pilot's career where you might be more dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always said between 500 and 700 hours, to me, that's a bit of that's a danger zone. Not that you as an individual, I don't know anything about your flying and the mentality. It seems like you bring the right attitude into it. But I think it's a place where you can start to become a little bit overconfident and a little bit complacent. Have you caught yourself in any type of complacency, or have you had those thoughts creep in? And if so, how have you mitigated that?
Yeah, I've heard the same thing, and I heard the same thing. I actually heard it right before I crossed over 500 hours, and I was like, okay, I'm going into this 500-hour mark. I should start being on my toes with myself. And yeah, that I don't know about complacency, but overconfidence. Definitely, we need to be confident individuals when we're flying aircraft, but pilots are not known for being the most humble people. That going in and going, okay, I'm not as cool or as awesome as I feel like I am, and recognizing that, we talk about, hazardous attitudes are kind of a funny thing that we talk about with the macho and everything like that, but it's true. It's, they're really real, and yeah, I've definitely caught myself. How have I mitigated it? I think that awareness is the biggest thing, and just being aware of yourself and going, okay, hold on, I'm about to hop in the helicopter. Even though my student just pre-flighted, I'm going to pull out the checklist and go through the checklist too. I'm not, immune to missing something, or immune to my student missing something. So, taking the checklist and actually using a checklist, or, going and doing a ferry flight, it's tempting to hop in and be like, oh, this is just me, solo, quick ferry. Don't need the startup checklist. But I should. The Robinson safety course, Bob Muse, the Robinson, I guess he's the chief pilot there, or he was when I was there.
He still is.
He said something along the lines of, the checklist is not for you necessarily to pull out and go through thing by, item by item every single time. It's for you to pull out and go, okay, I could probably miss something, and to pause. It's like it's a pause tool. And I've used it like that. And so, yeah, using checklists and just realizing that, this is a vulnerable time period. And then taking, things that do humble you really seriously when a student does something, or and you go, whoa, didn't see that one coming. Going, okay, that's going to happen again.
The oh poop moments, right? I mean, I think every instructor is going to have a couple of them where your heart feels like it's about to beat out of your chest. There's times where students will do some silly things. Helicopter might do something silly as well.
Yeah.
I've always said, like, it's first and foremost, if you neglect to do something once, it's easier to neglect it in the future. So I've always used that as an example of like a checklist, right? Like, if you start not relying on the checklist, and again, you don't have to go line by line. I like to do like a do then verify method, in a commercial application.
Yep.
But if you don't do it one time, it's much easier to then not do it a second time, and third and fourth and so on. I think there's like a rule of 300, right? You can theoretically get away with doing something incorrectly 300 times until it bites you. And the checklist is an easy thing. So I always try to, and look, I haven't been perfect. I've had every hazardous attitude probably in the book. And I was very young when I was flight instructing. And for me, I don't think I had really the highest level of maturity at that point. I look back and it kind of scares me. But as I've developed into, commercial flying and going through my career, I started to kind of take mental notes of like slight, like little mental red flags of like, okay, if I have this thought, it should cue me to stop what I'm doing and recognize the thought and then do whatever it is that thought is telling me to do. So like walking out to the helicopter, if I just get in, red flag, I didn't do my walk around. Well,
Right.
why is it important to do a walk around? Well, your blades might be tied down, gas cap might be off, your skid may be caught on something, you may have cowling doors open. So boom, it's a red flag. Like if you just get in, you should pop a red flag and assess why you're doing what you're doing. Checklist is always a red flag.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you just have to kind of develop that. I think you have to also just be humble. The helicopter doesn't care how cool you think you are.
Yep.
Gravity doesn't apply to your ego. It doesn't apply to the size of your bank account. If you're a private, wealthy owner, operator, it doesn't care, right? The helicopter is going to bite you hard. So I think it's important. And, it seems like you're doing the right things. What's been some of the challenges of being a newer instructor? I mean, now I think you're kind of now on the tail end of your instructor experience, right? You've now crossed the 500-hour mark of total time. You've gained plenty of experience, obviously, of dual given. What are some of the challenges that you've experienced? What are some of the things that have been surprising to you?
It's a good question. Challenges. I think challenges with flight instructing are one of the biggest things that I've realized is that being a flight instructor is often like, you end up being a life coach too, or at least you want to be. Whether that's received or not, is up to the student on the other end. But looking at some of my students who I look at and go, man, there's so much potential here. If they could just come in more, or if they could just, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I have this desire for my students to go and be the best pilot they can be, and the best person they can be as well. And sometimes you got to hold back a little bit and go, okay, I'm just a flight instructor. Of course, things in life do affect flight. Everything, from finances, because it's expensive or it doesn't pay what you want it to at first, or what it, what some people might need it to, or finances, health, the I'm safe checklist, all that. I think that's one of the biggest challenges I feel like I face in my own heart is I'm like, I want to fix everything in people's lives, not just the way they do a slope. But that's
you need to eat better and do better in your slopes.
Right.
If you just ate healthier, you could slope land
your slopes better would be better, and that's not always true. But
well, I think it's important. I think as an instructor, you have to be able to somewhat evaluate the room a little bit, right?
Right.
Evaluate where your students at, where are they at that day? Are they having a good day? Are they having a bad day? And sometimes being like the roadblock, right? Like student comes in, they're in a crap mood, they've been rushing, it's just not setting up to be a great, successful day. I think it's a great learning opportunity to say like, hey, what's the mission today?
Right.
I mean, the mission has no bear, right? I mean, yeah, you got to get your hours, got to get your certificate, but in the grand scheme of things, if we do not fly today, nothing changes, nothing bad happens. But if we do fly today and you're bringing this mindset into the cockpit, well, then that could actually translate into something that's kind of negative and even dangerous. And I think it's important as instructors to help students realize that, because hopefully then they can bring that into their commercial career. Now, obviously, when you're getting paid to fly for someone, you're going to have good days, bad days, and everything in between. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can just cop out on not flying because you're in a bad mood. But what it does mean is that you can recognize, I remember Eli that one time, was talking about how he noticed that when I was kind of in a mood, I didn't fly very well.
Yeah.
And so that should be a red flag. Like, hey, I'm not in the best mood today. My wife is mad at me because of this or that or whatever it may be. Okay, I need to stop. I need to take a deep breath, and I need to kind of assemble my thoughts and where my mind's at.
Yeah.
Because the mental game, especially as a young pilot, the mental game is so much. As you become more experienced, one could argue that you can kind of deal with it a little bit better. But in the beginning, so much of a student's success is based on the attitude that they bring into the cockpit that day.
Yep.
And it can start off great, right? You could have 30 minutes of great flying, and then one little thing goes wrong, and it's like that student that is so self-critical that they just can't handle it. It's your job as the instructor to say, hey, look, I don't think we're going to really be productive anymore today.
Right.
Let's go land. They may be upset at the time, and then you have a chance to debrief and kind of, fill in the blanks. I think that they, hopefully recognize it better. So
Yeah, and remembering that I was that student. It's like I was a student that at 40 minutes was fried, and my instructor took the time to go and made the sacrifice of his flight time and his paycheck and to go. I think we're done. I don't need that extra 0.2.
Yeah, it's interesting. The training intensity is hard. It's exhausting.
It is.
And I remember getting into instructing. That was one of the harder parts for me in the beginning was, up to that point, my flights were, 1.5 tops, maybe occasionally a little bit longer for a long cross country or something like that. And then, you get into flight instructing, you get busier and busier. And before you know it, you're flying back to back to back to back to back. And you're like, man, by the end of the day, you're zonked.
Yep.
I think I started kind of in the spring going into summer up in Oregon. It's not like it's the world's hottest place, but it's pretty warm in the summer, and we were at that time wearing these khaki fire retardant flight suits that were hot and gross and sweaty.
Yep.
By the end of the day, man, I felt like I'd ran a marathon.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same here in the Northeast, and yeah, the summers can be hot, and you end up doing 5 flights in a row.
You guys definitely get a little more mugginess. Well, Eli, I really appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you reaching out. I think it's always fun to hear from people and connect with new people. That's one of the magical things about the podcast is not that I never had the ability to talk to whoever I want, right? We all kind of have that ability, but one thing that the podcast has granted me is this access to talk to all sorts of people within the industry.
Yeah.
And that's a really neat experience because it's fun to kind of hear everyone's path, everyone's story. I think we all have relatable paths. We all kind of go in different directions sometimes. And it's fun to hear how you have gotten to your place. I'm sure that we're talking to a couple listeners specifically today. It's maybe it's the older guy or gal that's, wanting a second career, wanting to finally do this, make that switch. That's the cool thing about doing the podcast. So I appreciate you coming on and being willing to share your story. It's Independent Helicopters, correct?
Yeah. Independent Helicopters. We've got 2 locations. So I'm at our Saratoga location north of Albany in upstate New York. And then we've got another location down at Stewart International Airport, have our own heliport down there up on a hill overlooking the airport. It's beautiful.
Sweet.
Do a good amount of city operations out of there too, New York City. And yeah, we've got, I think 5 instructors right now, plus Matt and Heather. And 9 helicopters. It's a great place to train, great place to work. High quality.
Are you guys 61, 141, both?
We do both.
Just 61?
Both. We do mostly, especially here in Saratoga, we do a lot of Part 61. I recommend it, man. Part 61 is great because if, going back to that early pre-private student who's struggling with autos, you don't have to only do autos. You can go, okay, let's go or hovering. Go work on your flight at altitude and then come back to hovering. And instead of being totally, wasted after 8 flights, they're getting the whole helicopter. So yeah, we do a lot of Part 61, but we do Part 141 as well. And
if you're listening to the podcast and you're not familiar with 61 or 141,
good.
It's essentially just the regulation of what you're training under, what's the best way to put this? What is the requirements to get to the certificate? And 61 is
more flexible.
Essentially I could open up a helicopter flight school tomorrow and start giving Part 61 instruction. I open up Part 61 and I look at what the requirements are and I have my students go to those requirements. Like Eli said, you can mix and match. It's not a ton of structure, which, one would argue that could add some issues, right?
If
not done correctly.
Yeah.
It depends on the instructor and the organization. And 141 is an approved training. So they have TCOs, a training course outline that's approved by the FAA. And essentially, if you're listening to the podcast and like you're a VA guy or gal and you want to use your GI benefit, you're going to have to go 141 because that's what then gets associated with a flight school or like a college that's attached to a flight school or whatnot. but yeah, it's a little more stringent, right? You got to follow each lesson in sequential order. If you want to bounce around, you have to do a syllabus deviation, if I recall correctly, from my 141 day. So, lots of things to consider. But when you're going to your flight school, check in, ask them the questions. Hey, is this 61? Is it 141? It's not that one is necessarily better or the other. There's some different requirements for each. Again, if you're VA, you're fairly locked into the 141 if you're going to use your GI Bill. But yeah, check out Independent Helicopters, operating in the Northeast. Heather Halley, the owner,
Independent
great presence on social media.
Yeah.
I've chatted with her briefly. I think we're going to get her on the podcast at some point. It would be super
her
cool.
and Matt too would be awesome. Yeah.
I think it's neat. I think that the one thing that's lacking in aviation is female representation. I think it's not just helicopters. I think it's more prevalent in helicopters to have less females. So not only is it cool to have women in aviation, but it's cool to have women that are business owners within aviation, women that are notable figures within the industry. I think that, again, with social media and everything that's out there today, her videos can hopefully help inspire the next generation.
Yeah, and they do
not just
a lot of people
the
reaching out.
Typical young male pilot, but also, engage with some females. So I think that's pretty cool. Eli, thank you so much for joining the podcast. To our listeners, thank you again for listening.
Yeah, Halsey, thanks for having me.
Of course, man, it was fun. Thanks for reaching out. I'm going to talk to your buddy next week, so I'm excited to do that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Again,
he's got a lot of stories. He's a lot of fun.
Yeah, he seems like a great guy. I got his resume, so I'm excited to chat with him. If you're listening and you have a guest recommendation, please reach out. Or if you'd like to be a guest, there's no shame in that as well. We all have a story to tell, and that's the whole premise of the Helicopter Podcast. It's about helicopters, but more importantly, it's about the cool people that fly helicopters or work on helicopters or work around helicopters. And so that's what's been really neat about this. This episode should come out before HAI Heli Expo. If you're going to be at Expo, I think on the 28th, which is Wednesday, it's the second day, in the afternoon at the Vertical Magazine booth, we're doing a podcast meetup for Vertical Helicast. So that's going to include myself, John Gray from the Hangar Z, and also Jason Quinn from the Real Rescue. And I'm going to be roaming around the show for the whole time. So if you see me, please stop me, say hello. Love to connect and chat with you guys all at Heli Expo. Have you been to Heli Expo yet, Eli?
I haven't. I would love to go eventually. Yeah, it sounds awesome.
It's cool. Yeah, Heli Expo is like the one place where, the industry always feels kind of small. And then you go to this place and it's like, oh, wow, there's like 50,000 other people that share this same crazy passion that I do. So it's like the one time a year. It's like the Comic-Con, for helicopter guys and gals. So always a pleasure. If you're at HAI this year, come stop by. Again, thank you to Vertical Helicast for sponsoring and making the podcast possible. Chat with you all later. Thanks, Eli.
Thanks, Halsey.
Hey, podcast listeners. My name is Halsey Schider, and I'm the principal broker and owner of Celicopter. Celicopter is a new age, data-driven, helicopter-specific sales brokerage, bringing helicopter listings to new heights. At Celicopter, we utilize digital positioning, paid advertising, and our large network of industry professionals to move your helicopter quickly and efficiently. Unsure the value of your helicopter? Lucky for you, Celicopter offers a complimentary market evaluation. All you have to do is contact the team today. Are you ready to take your helicopter listing from Mayday to payday? Easy. Fill out the contact information below, and a Celicopter pilot agent will reach out shortly. Celicopter. List it, sell it, done.